Yeah, so we're going to open up the floor to questions or comments now. So is there anyone that wants to be the first to get started? Sir?
Yeah, I just wondered, given the amount of carbon that's put into the atmosphere from agricultural activities, both using fossil fuels and especially land use change that's removing carbon from the soils, was that brought up at all at Paris? And I know Monsanto was one of the proud sponsors, so I guess it didn't get handled much, but anything.
So the question for the video, because I know everyone heard you because you have a booming voice, but the question is really about land use, farming, some of these other types of things that we all think about, but we don't hear that much about how it came up in Paris. So can you address that?
These are things that could be energy generating rather than consumptive, if it's done in a more holistic way, recognizing that we live in cycles, not a linear fiction.
Yeah, great question.
So, yes, so Monsanto was definitely a big sponsor, and so part of this actually the climate, what was it, Solutions 21?
Yeah.
That Pune had mentioned.
Solutions COP21.
Solutions COP21. So there was a big framework around climate smart agriculture, which sounds maybe great, but it's a lot of it was GMOs, a lot of genetically modified work. On the whole, though, it's kind of fascinating. There was not a tremendous amount of discussion within the framework itself around agricultural, like emissions from animals or husbandry, perhaps, but there was a lot of conversation around how do you use soil as a sink, as a carbon sink. So looking at soil as a carbon sink as a solution, and thinking about how do we modify our crops to grow, were kind of at least from my perspective that I heard, were the major focuses and not around other aspects. But I wasn't in completely all that space.
I would say that the kind of the agriculture, the small farming contingencies around the world definitely showed up in high numbers, in droves, and there was one whole day that was dedicated to agriculture, and many of these issues were, there are a whole bunch of side events that day that spoke to Meatless Mondays, and that's just kind of an example of the variety of things that they spoke about, in addition to that.
Great.
But does the city of Philadelphia, since Pune, you're on the transition team, does the city of Philadelphia have a plan, or are we putting aside money for mitigating the impacts of climate change based on even the most conservative scenario of changing weather patterns and rising sea levels?
Right. So, okay. I mean, there's so much to talk about in that one question. So globally, there's this thing called the Green Climate Fund, right? What we talked about, which is kind of this whole $100 billion per year thing that goes into it. So, Anthony and I actually co-wrote an op-ed, which we sent to a certain newspaper that did not get published. When they publish other people's op-eds, where we kind of spoke of where this is actually kind of like a concept that it's arisen out of the climate justice work that Anthony's doing, which is having a just transition fund, where it's a fund that in part supports transitioning workers from fossil fuel industries to renewable and sustainable, energy industries. So it pays for, their skills training and health benefits, and and so that's kind of an example, of something like that. But what you're really kind of talking about is a fund for adaptation. And right now, the way I understand it, it's actually fairly fragmented. There's not a cohesive method to do that. Whether that's going to change in the future, it'll remain to be seen. But it's kind of like the water department has to come up with its, own thing, and then, each kind of like the streets department, comes up with its own, and the parks department, and there's not, currently, as far as I understand. And of course, much of this will be unveiled on January 4th when Kenny swears into office. Whether there's going to be a cohesive plan.
I wanted to go up to a very important point that I forgot your name. Anthony had pointed out, and to me, it's extremely important. With social justice, economic justice, social justice. You go into some of the poorest cities, whether it's in this city, whether in Philadelphia or along the state. For example, the environmental injustice, the trash that children are walking through, or the trash that you see piled along the highway, or that is in streams and whatnot. And again, you see it again with their lack of economic justice. You see the lack of social justice. How does all that play? And how do you get people who are just, barely getting by, let them realize that they are victims of, all these injustices, and what can we do to help them? We can't even get the city of Philadelphia to pick up the trash in some of these communities. It's really shocking. So I just wondered.
Yes. So, no, it's a great question. And actually, I'm going to speak, I'm going to give an example of a group that we work with from Louisiana called the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy. If anyone ever ends up in Slidell, Louisiana for some reason, look up Colette. Just say Colette and people will know who you're talking about. So Colette, post-Katrina, so Hurricane Katrina hit. Colette was actually a lawyer working in D.C. She returned home. She's like, I need to go back home. And so people were trying to recover from Katrina, and they knew, obviously, that it was the biggest storm that they faced. And she was trying to get folks to realize this happened because the oil companies in our state have destroyed the marshlands. Like, we no longer have the natural barrier. Climate change is happening. We're getting storms like this because of the oil companies in our state are contributing to this problem. And people were not, they weren't responding to that. Like, that was really hard because half the people worked for the oil company because it was like, this is what puts bread on the table, so we're not going to fight against them. And so what she has done a very long, and it's been 10 years post-Katrina, they just had their 10th anniversary, and they had like a couple hundred people down. I was down there for their commemoration. It was an amazing event. But she had to do deep work in doing both education and really kind of this connection. And so she had connected migrant workers who were coming in, who were doing the back end work for the oil companies under the table, who were trying to fight for status and residency within Louisiana and with the United States. She's working with them, and she was actually holding these cohort meetings with migrant workers, with longstanding black residents of the city, with people who've been displaced, who are trying to get back, but they no longer could because their land was displaced and then has been developed by outside investors, and now they couldn't afford it anymore. Into room and basically saying, all right, we have all these challenges and we're coming at it from different problems. So it's economic, it's criminal justice, it's education, it's environment. Who is the biggest, what's our biggest obstacle? And everyone got to the point, even people who actually work for an oil company, and were like, the oil companies. They are our biggest challenge. And then they power mapped. It's like, well, who are they influencing? Every single person in the legislature in the state of Louisiana, for the most part, and the city council. And they put a strategy, and they're like, all right, so people realize anything around housing displacement ended up being, land speculation was tied to what the oil industry did. Environmental problems was tied to what the oil industry did. The economy, tourism, fishing was tied to the impacts that the oil industry did. So people all saw it all tied to this fossil fuel company. And they started developing a plan, and they kicked it off at the 10th anniversary of like a 10-year plan, strategic plan on how to basically get Louisiana off oil. Like, if you can get Louisiana off oil, you can solve the climate problem in the United States. So it was a 10 year. This is 10 years, and they're still trying to bring people along. And they've been working with churches, so they did a lot of church engagement with black pastors, Latino pastors, white pastors, building urban-rural. So they did a big urban-rural connection. So thinking beyond New Orleans into the rest of the state. And she's been going around, beating down the doors, doing deep education work, deep organizing, and that's kind of how it's happening. And I don't know if it really answers your question.
Well, I guess I'm saying is you can't get people to realize that, climate change really begins with the trash in the streets.
Yeah.
60 million pounds of trash, illegally dumped trash, are picked up throughout the state. It starts there. Like, children have a right to walk in a clean street, and at the end have a right to drink clean water, have a right to have clean air, and it begins here.
Yeah.
So I guess that's where I see the lack of connect.
Sure. Yeah, and the one last point, maybe to kind of guess this is, so they've actually now she started a fund, which, very long story, but started a fund for visionaries, and some of the visionaries were actually trying to do their own kind of zero waste cooperatives. Because they were tying this, like, it actually has to do with the waste in our street right now. And if we do a zero waste as a model, maybe we can influence policymakers about the economic opportunities that this creates for our community. So it's both policy and it's models and it's organizing. In Louisiana, it's pretty cool.
First, thank you guys for taking the time and expense to be in Paris and represent all of us. I did have a little bit of a comment, and I think you both sort of alluded to this, but I just wanted to maybe clarify it for others, or at least ask you guys what you think. But I know you talked about the 1.5 degree goal in the preamble, which, if anybody's not aware, the preamble has no legal force. The main part of the text of the agreement, however, guarantees pretty much not a 2 degree increase, but a 3.5 degree increase, which is an unmitigated total disaster for humanity. So I think the takeaway from Paris is not the agreement itself, but the mobilization that it created, and the real action was in the streets of Paris and not in the conference. And this meeting is an extension of the streets of Paris and the beautiful protests that I encourage anybody who hasn't seen the Democracy Now! Videos of some of the protests there. They're absolutely beautiful, and I think there's a lot of that same energy in this room, and that's kind of my comment. I'd just like to hear what you guys have to say.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you for that. Do you mind if I just clarify one tiny thing? So you are correct that there is the preamble, and that doesn't have a binding force. And then the annex is kind of where it's funny, it's like legal language. That's like a whole nother education. But Article 2 of the annex says that this agreement, in enhancing the implementation of the convention, including its objective, aims to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty, including by holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. So the annex does say 2 degrees and 1.5. I know what you're referring to, which is that what happened was that all the INDCs that the countries submitted, which is the plan for each country, if you aggregate those at this moment in time, it's going to get us to 3.5. So the agreement says, but what we have on the table in terms of it's not even been operationalized yet, so it's quite possible that it won't even be 3.5. But if it were to be operationalized, each country's INDC at this very moment in time, it would be 3.5 degrees.
Fahrenheit or Celsius?
Celsius.
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 Yeah.
One of the things that I heard ongoing as the conference was going along was an undercurrent about market and business as taking a lead. And can you talk about what the sense was there, and with what you've learned about international talk about pricing carbon?
Yeah, so I was saying this earlier. I actually did not, and maybe it wasn't this. There's so much going on that maybe I just wasn't in the space. I didn't hear a whole lot of carbon pricing conversations, both inside. I know inside or out, but it could have just been where I was participating. But I did hear a lot about market solutions, so that was very, very real. And I think, for a lot of reasons, a lot of the groups, the contingency, the folks that I connected with are very critical and distrustful of markets for a lot of valid reasons. And I think there's a fear that, I sorry I keep going back to this red as an example, but that's the only one that's stuck in my head. The reforestation carbon offset market really has been highlighted as like a really positive solution. And again, on the face of it, it actually could sound pretty good until you realize the impacts when it plays out. And maybe there's some backwards way of talking about carbon pricing that way, but I actually was not in a lot of conversations where that came up. But it could have just been that it was happening and not where I was.
I have an anecdote. I decided to blog every day, and the blogs are on the PSR Philadelphia website, by the way, should you be interested. And so one day I sat down to do my blog, kind of like, get lunch and then sit down to do it. And then I start overhearing a conversation between two people in suits. And I know there's like this big, like people in suits are, like have to be business people. It's not always the case, I know, but these people were. And so then, and then their conversation was fascinating. It was fascinating. I almost felt like I wish I could have taped it. But essentially what they were saying, they were talking about kind of the falling stock prices of all the fossil fuel companies. They used, I think, Peabody maybe as an example, which went like from 42 to 7 or something like that. And then what they were saying was that businesses are seeing the writing on the wall about the carbon cap. So
cap or tap?
they said carbon cap. But so, and I know that they're not exactly the same thing, but to me, they're kind of like on the same spectrum, of a plan. So, that's kind of my non-scientific way of answering a question. But
so, real quick, on that, I think this is actually really why the thinking about how we develop our energy and conserve energy moving forward is really critical, because there's a woman from Friends of the Earth International who said this one time in a meeting, and it's really profound. It's stuck with me ever since. She said, the slave economy was powered by renewables. Wind powered the sails that brought Africans over to the U.S., and the sun powered the crops that was grown, and it was harvested by human labor. Like, those are 3 renewable resources of energy. So just going to renewables, while it may be good for carbon emissions, doesn't necessarily mean we're going to get to equity or justice. And so I think it's really important, because businesses, I'm not saying all businesses are bad either, but because there's been some really egregious actors are seeing the writing on the wall, they're going to want to remain profitable. They're going to want to get in front and find ways to monopolize and control a renewable energy sector that really should be actually decentralized, distributed, and accessible by every single person here if possible. So that's just, I think it gets to the policy piece and it gets to the mobilizing. I think it's really important that we hold that and think about how we move policy to ensure that that happens. And the benefit is there's a lot of really good models happening already where community is ahead of it, and we just need to figure out how to continue that.
Going to the economic question, that's what really will change things in the end. When I was thinking about, you said, Copenhagen was a failure, and Paris is at least the start to where we need to go, which I agree with. I think the main difference, or one important difference from 2009 to now, is that as of around 2013, both wind and solar became more economical than oil and gas. Coal is still cheap, but people are phasing coal out anyway because it's just so bad, or trying to. I know some countries are not. So I think that is going to be really key, and we need to keep that discussion going forward.
One more. Let's take from this side of the room.
I've been really impressed with the strength and commitment of indigenous communities all over the world, Canada in particular. What do you know about Pennsylvania, Philadelphia area in terms of us supporting indigenous groups who are working on climate change issues?
Okay, how about one more?
So in terms of the INDCs that the countries have to submit, is there anything in the agreement?
We can't hear you.
Speak up.
Okay. Is there anything in the agreement about how these plans will be enforced and what consequences, legal or otherwise, there will be?
I'll just talk a little bit about, so I attended this thing called the Equator Prize Award, which there's a blog on it if you guys are interested, and it was fascinating. It's a award that's given by UNDP to in 4 different categories. One of them was indigenous people protecting forestation of their land, in their land. 2 is obtaining rights to the land that you live on, which is kind of a crazy concept. But apparently there's indigenous people who don't have rights to their land. New to me. And then there was 2 other categories that I can't really think about right now. And there's a clip for each category that was done about the 5 organizations from each category around the world that won those prizes. It's narrated by Edward Norton, and it's amazingly powerful. You just kind of feel like what you're doing is nothing compared to these people who are kind of living this every day. People in Brazil stopping dams, and people in Guyana using mapping to track illegal loggers of forests. And so if you ever, I just would say that's kind of, it's an amazing piece that that I really enjoyed, and I know it doesn't tie into anything in Pennsylvania. I'll let Anthony talk about that. And then I'll just answer the enforcement of the INDC. So one of the reasons they said this was a successful agreement is because it was voluntary. Up until now, it had been people were kind of had to sign on, and it would be they would have to be. So there are pieces of it that are not voluntary, that are binding, and one of them is that everybody has to come up with something, right? That piece of it. But then, how does that get enforced? And so. And honestly, I think that, and I'll look up the exact, but that was particularly the enforcement, that was, I think, one of the things that was blocked by the Arab nations, the Gulf nations. And so how is it going to be enforced? Nobody knows.
Yeah, just real quick, I think to Mordecai's point, definitely a huge, on the outside, especially in the outside space, all the events outside of the COP, I feel like that was almost everyone shared that. This is a movement for peace, for global justice. This is actually more than just, climate change is a really great entryway into a greater justice system, in particular because climate change is caused by the current injustices that have existed through our economy and different avenues. Inside the space, it's definitely mixed. So there are some people who held that, other people who didn't. It was really interesting being even within the U.S. space contingent of big greens, smaller groups like ours, which don't even register on the Richter scale compared to big greens. How people approached the climate talks were really varied, which was interesting because I know, for example, some of the representatives of Sierra Club were very focused on carbon emission reductions. Yet I know people who work in Sierra Club who bring a deeper global justice framework. And there's a disconnect within that organization. So how that moves is going to be, I think, work that people who do local chapters in Sierra Club, being able to move the national office, I think it'd be really critical. For indigenous in Pennsylvania, I'm not 100% sure. But maybe a question for research, which would be interesting. Again, going back to Louisiana, there's a tribal community called the Houma Nation that has been fighting for recognition for God knows how long, forever. And the reason they have not been recognized is because their land sits on top of mineral rights that the oil companies want. They've actually been told by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, that the reason why we are not approving this is because you're on top of these mineral rights. So they've actually been told that in writing. They actually have that as proof, which is ridiculous. It's historical, and it's just always so they've been struggling, and if they can do that, if they can get rights, then that means they can stop drilling and they can actually start getting federal funding for mitigation, adaptation, et cetera. They can't get any of that because they're not recognized. I don't know if that is happening in any communities in Pennsylvania. I don't know. That would be interesting to see if there's any indigenous communities.
Well, they are not recognized
as
a tribe.
So I wonder if part of the reason is because maybe they're sitting on gas reserves.
Lancaster has an anti-fracking indigenous.
Okay. So that's great.
Chester has had a strong environmental justice movement.
Yes, for sure.
So I think we're gonna wrap up now because I know that 350 wants to give some people an opportunity to talk about their organizations. But I think that I've been impressed by, first of all, the ongoing climate justice movement that's happening here in Philadelphia and around the world, and the fact that we can choose to look at this Paris Agreement, in one of two ways. We can look at what it doesn't contain, or we can look at how we can use it to continue to really mobilize and be hopeful. Because honestly, if we don't think it's possible to make a difference and that we can do this, we might as well just give up right now. So I think, I think it's really up to us to sort of choose to use this as a way to, whatever way we can, keep going and recognize the power that's in this room and with our peers. So with that note, I think I'm going to welcome Jen up to talk about and why don't we give our panelists and yourselves